This conversation on ethics in agricultural biotechnology took place during May 1993 on the campus of Iowa State University. It was made possible by the ISU Bioethics Program and the ISU Biotechnology Public Education Program. This program deals with animal rights. Participants will discuss the question, should we attribute moral rights to animals? Now, here's your moderator.
Hello, my name is Gary Comstock. We're here at Iowa State University discussing ethics in agricultural biotechnology. Our topic for tonight is animal rights, and I'm joined by what may be the world's two leading experts on the subject of moral rights for animals, and we're going to have a conversation about this idea. On my right is Professor Tom Regan, the author of The Case for Animal Rights, a book that came out in 1983 and has affected many people's lives, including my own. I read it and was convinced to become a vegetarian because of his arguments. Tom teaches philosophy at North Carolina State University. On my left, another good friend, Ray Fry, professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University, and among the many interests that Professor Fry has, one of them is responding to arguments about rights for animals. It's by no means his only interest, but it is one in which he has distinguished himself. The case for moral rights for animals depends on rather sophisticated philosophical arguments, and we will give Tom Regan a chance to get into those insofar as he's able. But I'd like to begin by asking him to comment a little bit on how we see animals and what dimensions of the human-animal relationship seem important to him. Tom?
Well, thanks, Gary, and it's really a pleasure to take part in this conversation. When I was 17, 18, 19 years old, I was a butcher, and my job was to take the hindquarters of animals and bring them out for the really expert butchers, and then what was left over, I would make the ground meat, and I would do all the lots of trimming and the minute steaks, and put the chickens on the rotisserie and so on. And at that time in my life, the moral question about what I was doing was invisible to me. I mean, I didn't see any issue of any moral significance in all this. And as a matter of fact, I come from a working class family, and my parents had to quit school to make it through the Depression. And so in my family, when there was meat on the table, it was a sign of the American dream. We were prospering in America. And I grew up in that. And it wasn't until later in my life that I began to think about these invisible entities in my life. And I was really led to it because of thinking about the role that we have in our life by the power of our choice to vote for or against unnecessary pain, unnecessary death, unnecessary harm to other creatures. That's how I got started. And along the way, I tried to develop a more sophisticated argument, but my basic orientation to it was this notion that there was somebody who was invisible, who was hurting, and who was dead, and I didn't see it.
So your motivation for your view comes out of personal feelings that you have for animals.
Yeah, it does, except it was even more indirect, because the first thing we were active, and my wife and I, in the organizing the state of North Carolina in the war during the Vietnam period. We thought that young human men were being sent over there and dying for no good reason. Students my age at that time were going over and dying. It was in my classroom. I was a teacher by then, and they were dying, and we thought that was a case of unnecessary, unjustified death and suffering and so on, and we tried to stop that. And out of that, we just saw a connection between that kind of unnecessary death, unjustified harm, and what was happening to the animals. And it was through the work of the Indian political leader, Mahatma Gandhi, actually, who, of course, my working class family had no idea about all that Hinduism and so on, but we read that, And it struck a responsive chord. And so we, in a way, have tried to give a Western account of what Gandhi had in mind. What he had in mind really is this, that the animals are not ours. We can make them ours. We have the power to make them into our resources, treat them as our resources, simply treat them as things, property, chattel, sell them, buy them, kill them, whatever. We have that power, and they have no power to resist all that. They're never going to vote us out of office, for example. But at the same, what we saw was that, wait a minute, I mean, how can we, for some, the convenience, the taste of a hamburger, be party to the needless destruction of another sentient creature? We just couldn't see how we could do that. So since that time we've been working, and including in philosophy, trying to make it more sophisticated, trying to iron out the loose ends. But the incentive comes from that gut feeling of trying to help those who can't help themselves.
In our series on ethics and agricultural biotechnology, we're focusing on the philosophical arguments. And I don't think that you believe that only people who share this kind of feeling for animals are obligated to treat animals humanely and so on. What is the philosophical argument for moral rights for animals?
Well, it's a basic idea. See, I argue on the basis of extending the notion of rights from the members of the human family to include pigs and cows and chickens and so on. And I do that by trying to remind people in a certain way of the basic similarities that exist between us and the other animals. That we feel emotions, we remember things, we want things, we're frustrated, we feel stress, we feel fear, we have social relations, we have an emotional life, we can make choices, all that we share with the other animals. And this is not anthropomorphic. This is backed up by our best science, including Darwin and including the most recent work by scientists working in the field. This we know about the other animals with whom we share the earth. And it rests further on the notion that you don't exist as my resource, and Ray doesn't exist as my resource, and you're not mine, you're somebody, not something, and I have to try to, in my life, learn to respect you as I go forward in my life. Your being in the world places limits on what I can do in the world. And why? Well, because you have a life, and it's your life, and it means something to you. But then, see, what I want to try to argue in the most simplified terms is, well, so do these other animals. You don't think cows and pigs have lives that matter to them? Of course they do. So what we need to do is to live in the world in a way that recognizes their presence in it and recognize the limits it places on us, and that means that they don't belong between two slices of bread. We can put them there, but that's not their place in the scheme of things.
So the basis of your argument is not simply that you have feelings for animals, but that was how it started. The basis of the argument is that animals are similar to human beings in certain relevant ways. They can feel pain and pleasure.
Absolutely. See, because it wasn't the question, I mean, my feelings about animals, I mean, I didn't feel anything. I was putting them in a saw. I was hacking them and hewing them and putting them on the rotisserie and so on. It wasn't a question of feeling. It was a question of seeing the connection. And this requires thinking about things. It's not that the emotions are dead, but it does require just thinking about things and seeing, my goodness, if you oppose this because someone who hasn't done anything wrong, has no power, is being exploited by somebody who has the power, and you think that's unjustified when you're just dealing within the human family, and then you look at how we treat the other animals, you say, no, wait a minute, that's wrong too then. If the first one's wrong, that's wrong too. So it's a question of trying to think it through, not just feel it through.
Ray, what's wrong with the idea of attributing moral rights to animals?
Well, I think, Gary, the points that Tom has been making can be dealt with in a way that don't require the ascription of rights to animals. When we speak of treating animals humanely, it's very difficult to think of any contemporary theorist in ethics who would not wish to go along with that. And that would involve, perhaps, cleaning up some of intensive farming practices presently today, but also perhaps some practices involving animal experimentation. But the question is, must we attribute rights to animals in order to be able to treat them humanely? And I think the answer to that is no. Now, it's perfectly true that today rights have become the common currency of moral social debate. Everybody with a cause has suddenly discovered they have a right. And the problem is that debases the currency. We want to know how to tell when a genuine right is being claimed from when one isn't. All kinds of people can claim moral rights to all kinds of things. How do we know we're dealing with a genuine case? And that requires us, I think, Gary, to give very firm foundations to our claims about moral rights, and in particular then, to show how those foundations are, where they come from, how they're to be shored up and supported, and to show as well that they can resist certain kinds of attacks upon them. Now, in my case, having set aside the question of humane treatment, because I think that is a sine qua non of a person in my position, I certainly would support that. I do not support the attribution of rights to animals because I don't believe the claims are well grounded. Now, in Tom's case in particular, part of the reason I think that they're not well grounded is because I think that he attempts to show that humans have rights and then to extend the claim of rights to animals. So everything in Tom's case depends upon showing that, I presume, that humans have moral rights. Now, there has long been in philosophy, we might think, two major traditions. One which has formulated its views around the possession of rights, and one which is not. What I think happens is that Tom and I represent two different views about the essential quality of rights to an ethical theory. So let me give a specific example. I have no reason whatever to think that the reason why it's wrong to pour scalding water on a baby is that it violates some right of the baby. What makes it wrong is that the baby feels pain and suffering. Similarly, I find it extraordinary to think that what is wrong with pouring scalding water on a dog is anything other than the pain and suffering the dog undergoes. To say that what's wrong with my behavior is that it violates a right of the dog is, it seems to me, to make rights a kind of excess baggage. I can account for what's wrong with it independently of those rights. Now, someone will say, but can you account for what's wrong, for example, with enslaving people independently of some human right or moral right that they have? And I think the tradition I represent, the response has been, yes, of course I can. There are all kinds of ways in which enslaving someone blights their lives, means that they can't make of themselves what other people would be able to make of themselves, etc. All of that's true without ascribing certain kinds of rights, without ascribing moral rights. So why the fear of moral rights? I think the answer is, to any viewer who bothers to open up a newspaper, is that no resolution of conflicts of rights have we yet discovered. Abortion is a conflict between the right of the mother, the right of the fetus. Suicide is the right of a person to have the decision power to decide to die, versus the view that no, the state should have that power, or some higher authority should have that power, and that we produce a claim about rights, a conflict again. Now, until the resolution of these conflicts is possible, I don't see how moral social debate can be furthered by discussing these issues in terms of rights. And I would stress, we don't need to discuss them in terms of rights in order to talk about the humane treatment, whether of animals or of people. All of the arguments that would still be good with respect to arguing about humane treatment, whether of animals or people, hold quite independently of whether we think there are moral rights. So I think that the argument against ascribing rights to animals is a twofold. On the one hand, we seem very unlikely to get very far in discussing our treatment of animals if we try to make that treatment dependent upon their possession of certain rights. And secondly, the conflicts that involved in rights theory, the conflict of rights, are so severe that there apparently seems to be no resolution to them. Anybody familiar currently with the abortion debate will know exactly what I mean. It seems to me we'd have a far better chance of reaching some firm conclusion about the rightness or wrongness of certain farming practices, or certain cattle rearing practices, or certain practices involving animals and experimentation by discussing those directly, quite independently of any claim of whether the animals have rights.
So it sounds like you would agree with Tom on certain practical moral judgments, such as certain kinds of intensive farming techniques are inhumane.
Yes.
It's wrong to pour scalding water on babies and on dogs.
Right.
Where you disagree is when Tom wants to talk about the wrongness in these actions in terms of rights.
That's right. You
Now-
can put it this way, Gary, if I could. I have a view of rightness and wrongness that does not tie those notions to the possession of moral rights, whether by people or by animals. So I can talk about whether an act is right or wrong, even when I say the individual has no right in the matter. It isn't as if by saying an individual has no moral right in the matter, I can't actually discuss whatever's in question, intensive farming practices or whatever. And if they impose immense pain and suffering upon animals, without any corresponding gain of a major kind, I think we must condemn those practices. So on the practical side, I have some agreements with Tom, and the question, I think, is we're divided in terms of ethical theory, but that's not a trivial divide.
One of the practical differences between you, I know, to step back from the theory for the moment, is on the matter of meat eating, which requires the slaughter of animals. Let's talk about that one for a moment, and then maybe we can use that as an issue to circle back around to the importance of the difference between you on theoretical grounds, you being a utilitarian and Tom being a rights theorist. Tom believes that it's wrong to slaughter animals in order to eat them, and you do not. Is
No,
that right?
That's quite right.
Why
Yes.
not?
Well, I think that one has to look in the literature for the arguments given for why it's wrong to kill animals for food. And these arguments typically take two main forms. One appeals to the pain and suffering the animals undergo in intensive rearing methods. Now, if those methods are truly productive of great pain and suffering, then I think those methods have to be improved.
Then you oppose them.
Then I oppose them. The question is of whether or not, in the course of seeking those improvements, we can or cannot eat meat. If, for example, there's a practice that we want to reform, such as labor practices in factories, we don't close the factories in order to reform those practices. We keep the factories open, producing whatever's in question, and seek the reforms in question. That's one aspect. The elimination of pain and suffering, it seems to me, is something which people who hold my moral position have always been concerned with in the case of animals. That doesn't require that we abstain from eating meat in order to make those practices, to reform them. But the second argument is, I think, in the case of killing animals for food, even more powerful. And that turns upon the comparative value of animal life vis-a-vis human life. I think one of the things that many of your viewers are likely to believe is that human life is more valuable than animal life. What I've tried to do in some of my work is to give concrete reasons why that view is correct. It means, therefore, that it's worse to kill a human being than to kill an animal. The value of the life of one is greater than the other. And on the theory I hold, the killing of those animal lives can indeed be compensated for, that is, traded off against the virtues that are achieved, the benefits achieved, by the killing. Now, that killing brings food to our tables, medical reforms to our children and ourselves. It frequently brings medical advances for the animals themselves. But in particular, the array of benefits it offers us, including the economic livelihood of a vast number of people in this state, it seems to me, makes a coherent case for we need powerful reasons to discontinue this. These are factors that must be counted.
Tom, Ray's right. Many people in Iowa do make their living for themselves and their daughters and sons from raising and slaughtering pigs primarily. There are 8 pigs in the state for every human being. And if we stop eating meat, this will provide a hardship for them. What's wrong with the idea of weighing these costs and benefits in your mind?
Well, there's nothing wrong with weighing the costs and benefits attending an institution or a practice. And think of agriculture as an institution or a practice. It's a way of doing business. There's nothing wrong with saying, well, here are the benefits and here are the costs, and let's see how we can improve them and so on. If you have independent reason for thinking that the practice is itself morally justified, that is, if it that's fine. Then you just say, well, this is a good thing we're doing, it's morally justified, and we'll try to figure out whether the benefits are here and the harms there and so on. But the whole point, see, the fundamental point that we're trying to address and that we need to see if we can make just as crystal clear as we can, I think, is that is the issue. The issue is whether the practice itself, that is, commercial animal agriculture, raising animals as property, selling them as commodities, that institution or practice is itself morally justified. You see, where Ray and I would agree, in a certain sense anyhow, is this: we have particular cases within this practice of, like the veal crate or close confinement battery hen operations where chickens laying eggs and so on, which are egregious. I mean, they're the worst of the worst from the point of view of a lot of people. And see, what Raymond's calling for is to say, well, what we want to do is we want to improve this. We want to give the animals bigger cages, get them out of the crate and so on, but still keep the practice, still keep the institution. So it's like a reformist position. Whereas that assumes, you see, it doesn't address the issue of whether the practice is justified to begin with. And that is the animal rights perspective. The animal rights perspective is there's something unjust about this practice. And the way you address the injustice of the practice is not by keeping it and reforming it, but by eliminating it. So it's like, if I could give you just one example. And
give me some help. What would be an example of a practice that is not morally justified?
Well, let me give you an example of throughout history, anyhow, how people have debated a particular issue so that your viewers can get an idea of the dynamics here. It has to do with the death penalty, for example. Take that as, throughout civilized history, anyhow, some people have opposed the death penalty in principle. They wanted to abolish it on the grounds that it is uncivilized and primitive and all the rest of that. And it's noteworthy that amongst all the so-called elected democracies in the world, there are only 2 that have the death penalty, and that's South Africa and the United States. I mean, except for England has it for high treason. But otherwise, all the other countries, France, Italy, Germany, and so on, have abolished it on the grounds that it is inhumane and undignified and so on. At the same time, throughout history, there have been people say, no, it's all right to have the death penalty. We just have to reform it, make sure we do treat people with dignity and so on and so forth, and not execute them in public and so on. So that dynamic, see, when you have a practice where there are some people who want to keep it and improve it, cleanse it, as it were, and then there are others who want to say, no, there's something wrong with it. That's the sort of thing that's at issue here. And what we're trying to understand, all of us who are trying to think about the issue, and every human being as he or she thinks about it, is what is our relationship to these other animals? Are they merely pieces of property? Are they merely commodities? Is that what their role in the scheme of things is? In which case, then, what we want to do is have a humane agriculture, a humane research and all the rest. Or is it there something about this whole relationship that's founded on power, rooted in injustice, and that needs to be eliminated? That's the issue. And the animal rights perception, the animal rights position is that injustice reformed is injustice sustained.
Ray argues that attributing rights to animals only leads to clashing opinions and doesn't help us resolve the issue. I believe that he also wants to deny that humans have moral rights, or at least that's the wrong way to talk about rights and wrongs among us. How do you respond to that criticism?
Well, I respond by looking at the historical record. I mean, I think that history teaches us that, of course, I mean, see, rights are claimed by people who are threatened, usually by interests who have no power, or they're claimed on their behalf. In the social dynamics, again, it's from someone who's being denied something is going to more normally insist that they've got a right to it, and so it's usually the rights are in recent history anyhow. It's the vocabulary of the disempowered. It's the vocabulary of children working in factories for 10 cents a day for 10 hours a day. It's the vocabulary of slaves on plantations and their people representing their interests and trying to achieve their freedom, their literal emancipation. It's the vocabulary of women who are denied education, denied the vote, denied ownership of property. It's that vocabulary that's insistent. And of course, anytime some disempowered person comes along, or a representative of the disempowered, and says, there's a right here, those who have power are going to say, well, we've got a right. And so there is going to be this debate that goes on, the dynamics of my right versus your right. But the suggestion that somehow we get by without talking about this, and that history teaches it, and the history teaches us just the opposite, that the way children got better treatment, the way people of color were liberated, the way that women found their freedom was through the vocabulary of rights. It was that their rights in the cauldron of debate ended up being stronger than the rights that opposed them. I agree that there's always going to be a debate about rights, but that doesn't mean that the rights is not an important part of the rhetoric of progress. And the idea, again, that we can just dispense with this, or that anyone who claims to have a right has a right, that's not true. Because, see, slave owners didn't have a right to own slaves, and factory owners didn't have a right to exploit children, and men didn't have a right to deny the basic development and freedom of the women that married them. They may have thought that, but what hard thinking and other forces finally conspired to prove is that they were wrong. And the animal rights movement, animal rights philosophy, has that same forward thrust. We know we're bucking tradition. We know we're talking a vocabulary that threatens those who have power. We know that the animals can't speak for themselves. They're much like the children in the Industrial Revolution. But the idea that, I think that people, let's put it this way, people who want to say get rid of the vocabulary of rights are people who are satisfied with the status quo. They're protective of the status quo politically. That's what I think is going on when it comes to those who lack rights.
Ray, if you do want to reform certain kinds of animal farming practices, are you optimistic that you can do it without the strong language of rights?
Oh, yes. I think, in fact, as one listens to Tom, I think in part that he is correct in saying that rights basically today is rhetoric. Whenever you have a cause and you want to advance the cause in today's modern political climate, heavily influenced by legal paradigms, you claim a right to whatever's in question. And so we see on our front pages of our newspapers a constant claiming of rights here, there, and everywhere. Now, that in itself does not show that rights is not, the rhetoric of rights is not doing any work. In fact, it is doing work. It's placing those who disagree with the claims being made in a somewhat unenviable position. It's always difficult to push uphill than it is to push downhill. But I would point out something which one has to see very clearly about this when Tom uses as the examples slavery and whatever. It is presently in this state and in every other state in the United States perfectly legal to own animals, that farmers have property rights in those animals. And when one says the rhetoric of debate is by the disempowered, vis-a-vis the animal controversy at least, what strikes me in particular is that the legal framework within which we live in this country grants us exactly what Tom's animal rights philosophy would presumably deny us: ownership of animals. Now, how does one go about reforming these practices in the absence of rights? I think the answer is you try to expose the practices. You try to expose what's being done within them, and in exactly the way in which child labor was reformed through child labor laws. In our early factories at the end of the Industrial Revolution, we didn't close the factories in order to proceed. What we did was we reformed the practices that these children were undergoing and kept our factories open. Now, Tom would have it that the only way we could do that is by ceding children rights. Well, there are all kinds of places in the world, Great Britain, the best case in point, where animal legislation vis-a-vis animal welfare is far in advance of that in the United States. But no one there, at least in the Parliament, concedes animals' rights, and certainly not the kind of moral rights that would be relevant to the discussion that we're presently having. So the problem that exists is, do I want certain practices reformed? Yes. Do I believe the rhetoric of rights is required in order to reform them? No. And in fact, I would go further. I believe that in fact, the animal rights philosophy, by its insistence that we attribute rights to animals, actually may not be the friend of animals at all. Because what it does, as is evident in our discussion today, is to divert us from discussion about the practices in question that we find perhaps reprehensible or not, or what's being done over animal experimentation, or what's being done over genetic engineering vis-a-vis animals. It diverts us from an explicit consideration of those issues to the question, do or do not animals have rights? And that question is basically a question of abstract philosophy. We can see whether humans and animals have legs. We can't see whether they have rights.
See, on the contrary, though, see, to dwell on, to take our energy, our time, and resources, and spend them on considering this egregious case and that egregious case and this egregious case is to be party to acceptance of the injustice of the institution. It is only through the rhetoric of rights, and I'm perfectly happy to think that there is a rhetoric to this. It's not, I also think it's true, but I think it has a powerful rhetorical force. When we talk about the rights of somebody, we're talking about something serious. That's what that means, something important, something that means something to us, not just something to the right holder. So it has a rhetorical force. But the point is, see, if we just think about examples and examples, then we forget to think about the whole institution. And it is by talking about the rights of animals, just as it was by talking about the rights of women, the rights of gays, the rights of children, that we're reminded of the deep-seated and the pervading discrimination that is practiced against those who lack power on the part of those who have power. And those who are in the middle, like I was when I was 18 years old, who was invisible. It didn't exist for me. And so it's really that, in a way, I think those of us, and all issues, not just this one, see, we're all sleeping through some important issue. It's not, so I wouldn't want to come across trying to say somehow we're morally advanced. I mean, we're all, there's an important moral issue, or many of them, I'm sure that that's invisible to all of us. All that I want to suggest is that the animal issue is an important issue for people to begin to address as at its foundation, meaning by that we need to think not only about boiling water on a dog, that's terrible. See, that is terrible, and we agree on that. But it's also just the whole notion that those animals exist between two slices of bread for us that is the more fundamental question.
If I could just quickly respond, Gary, I mean, I think that the problem we have here is that Tom insists that we have to look at the morality of the practice, seemingly independent of whatever it is that we're pointing to as particular manifestations of that practice in ordinary life. My problem is simply this. It is perfectly legal to own cows and pigs and chickens in this state and every other state. So the animal rights philosophy must insist that the moral rights found within it trump, outweigh, have more force than the legal rights conferred upon us in this state. Now, I think the rhetoric of rights gains what force it's had when Tom appeals in the human case precisely to our agreement eventually of the presence of legal rights in many of these areas. It's the point of the use of moral rights, as it were, perhaps not overnight, but the use of moral rights to dispossess every cattle farmer in Iowa of the beef in which that cattle farmer has a property
You see,
right.
when I said earlier that those who want to deny the ascription of rights to animals are really speaking for the status quo, and it might have sounded like that was just speculative on my part, but there he is. Now he's saying, look, there is the status quo, people own animals, they make money off of animals, these people have rights. If they have their way, you won't be able to do that. We don't want to talk about rights. See, what I think is that there's a subterranean agenda to people who want to deny the ascription of rights to animals beyond the philosophical one. I'm happy to talk about the philosophical arguments, but it is anyone who wants to deny rights to a disempowered group it wants to keep the people in power. And what I would point out is simply that the same argument, that is that Smith has a right and is protected by the law and so on and so forth, that same argument has been given throughout history to justify those who are exploiting somebody to continue their exploitation. It's the same pattern of argument. Now, we might debate whether we can rationally say, on the one hand, yes, that argument does occur over here when human beings are exploiting human beings in slavery and child labor and so on. We might debate whether that same pattern of argument can be extended over to how we treat other animals. I'm happy to debate that. But it is the same pattern of argument.
No, I would deny this. It isn't the same pattern of argument precisely for the divide that Tom has drawn. When we have this kind of argument, when we talk about cases involving human beings, what typically happens in our country is that, as I think history will bear out, that as we proceed through the years, we find the codification in statute law of legal rights of individuals. And what we find is the following. Tom says, but look, even when the underlying practice is objectionable, we've always found people saying, well, these are my rights or whatever. But I would urge you to pay attention to the fact that he hasn't yet shown that the legal rights we hold in cattle are immoral. And the point that seems to be at issue is exactly where is it the case that the having of property rights in animals runs afoul of morality? Now he says, well, look, the whole practice must be questioned. It's not a way of relating to animals. I don't understand. Elderly women are very fond of their pets.
Oh, now this is going to
Now, wait.
this is going to be some kind of caricature of what's going
No,
on.
no.
We're not talking about whether
No, no,
we're
I'm
talking about
coming
an
to the-
institution, right?
I'm coming to farming. It is that what we lack is when someone says, well, what's wrong with this? All we find is it violates the rights of animals. But the whole point of the controversy is you must show they have rights in the first place. It's not an immoral practice to violate rights unless they have rights. And what I'm suggesting in my arguments with Tom is that he hasn't shown they have rights. Therefore, he hasn't shown it's immoral to hold property rights in cattle.
But we'll go back to this then, because you show me, then you explain. See, what you have to understand is that Ray thinks that you don't have rights. Ray thinks your viewers don't have rights. Ray thinks he wants to
Moral rights.
That's right, moral rights. And what he thinks, in other words, is that we can do all of our moral business perfectly well without ascribing moral rights to human beings.
Let me just add,
To human beings.
with legal rights and the discussion of right and wrong about the
Right.
practices involved. There is no denial that human beings have legal rights.
No. So what a good test case for anyone listening to this, it seems to me, would be something like this. Do you think that you have, apart from what the government tells you you're permitted to have, apart from anything in the law that's written by people, do you think you have a right to decide what you want to do in your life, what you want to buy, where you want to travel? Do you think you have those rights? Do you think they're yours? And if you do, as I think you do, that you have a right not to be hurt by somebody because they're going to get pleasure out of it. You're going to go down, apart from any legal right, apart from anything. And if people say yes, 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 yes to the above, then they're going to be in a school of thought, in a current of thought like mine. That is to say that in order to try to mark the insistence, the importance of a certain form of behavior, my freedom in this case, I want to mark that. I want to put a flag down. I want to say right, not just you have a duty or would be wrong or whatever, it's immoral. I want to say something stronger, and that's what the vocabulary of rights says. So those people who share my beliefs about these few examples are going to have to disagree with what Ray's saying, that is that we can do all our business, moral business, without putting that flag down.
But I think, Gary, that the truth here is quite the opposite. That is, that your viewers will not agree with that. I would just ask them to reflect on something. The kind of rights that Tom has just mentioned about do you want to make your own decisions and whatever, well, those sorts of things or activities are engaged in by all kinds of people, even those that don't think that there are rights. Here's the question. The woman asserts under Tom's aegis a right to abortion on demand. The Catholic pro-life lobby, for example, denies the existence of such a right and asserts a right to life on behalf of the fetus. Now, that's what your viewers must ask themselves. What they must ask themselves is over a series of quite specific moral, social issues. What happens if you're of Tom's persuasion is you find both camps asserting rights. Now, my view is, given how liberal rights theorists are today, liberal in the sense of how liberal they are with the number of rights they cite, that if you're the theorist, you can claim anything you like. My problem is, who's right? Is the woman right when she says she has the right to abortion on demand? Is the Catholic right when he asserts that no, the fetus has a right to life? And I could produce this with every other social issue that we talk about today. Women's rights, gay rights, children's rights, ecological rights, etc. And the problem with the rights philosophy is that it's simply, unless you're appealing to legal rights where we can get a handle on it because we know how they come into existence, we know how to perpetuate argument about them, the problem is we simply don't know how to adjudicate that dispute between the woman and the Catholic.
I'm going to have to break in here. I'm afraid we're out of time. It is clear that there's a real disagreement, both on a practical level in terms of what we ought to do regarding our relationships to animals between you, and a clear disagreement about moral theory, about the importance of talking about ethics in the terms of moral rights. We have a rights theorist and a utilitarian, and the disagreements are clearly articulated tonight by both of you, for which I thank you. And you've given us and the viewers cause, I think, for probing a little bit deeper, both into the questions of how we really ought to treat animals. There are points on which you agree that we ought to reform certain practices in agriculture, and also into the theoretical grounds of our attributing even to human beings moral rights. And if we decide that we should attribute to human beings moral rights, then we can take up the arguments for extending those rights to animals on the basis that you articulated at the beginning, that they're similar to us in many ways.
It's food for thought, Gary.
It's food for thought.
Thank you both for coming here a long ways to be with us, and for speaking so articulately and provocatively for us.
Thank you,
Thank
Gary.
you. Thank you.
Good night.